Rain struck the cobbles in hard, slanting lines, and Eleanor MacDonald crossed the coaching yard with a trunk against her shoulder that dragged her sideways at every third step. Dawn had not yet arrived. Lanterns burned in wet halos above the stables. Horses stamped and snorted steam into the dark. Her boots had taken water before she reached the gate, and each step made a soft, ruined sound that seemed too small beside the iron clatter of wheels and harness. No one offered to help her. Two porters watched from under an awning, their caps low, their hands in their pockets. A woman in a plum mantle glanced once at Eleanor's soaked hem and looked away with the quick indifference of someone guarding her own thin safety. The trunk was not hers. Nothing in it was hers. Lady Norbury had sent her before daylight to collect dress silks and trimmings from a Bond Street modiste who would not deliver without payment in hand, and Eleanor had stood there while the clerk counted each coin twice and then tied the parcel with care fit for a queen. The same hands that had wrapped velvet had passed the burden to her as if she were a mule hired by the hour. Her right palm had split 2 days earlier on a needlepoint while mending Valenciennes lace that Lady Norbury said she was too coarse to touch. The cut had opened again. Rain found it at once. Her fingers burned and then numbed. She shifted the trunk and kept walking. By the time she reached the middle of the yard, hunger had become a clean pain beneath her ribs, sharp and narrow. She had eaten half a crust at noon the day before, and nothing since. In Lady Norbury's house, meals arrived by rank, and rank was a weapon disguised as etiquette. Eleanor was called when guests had finished and plates had cooled. If there was stew left, she ate. If not, she drank tea gone bitter and told her body to be still. She had learned that command as a child and perfected it as a woman. She was 22 and moved as if she were older, not from weakness, but from calculation. To waste motion was to invite collapse. A groom hurried past her with a blanket over his head and clipped her shoulder. The trunk slipped. She dropped to one knee in black water, caught the handle before it struck the stones, and rose again with her jaw locked so hard her temples throbbed. Mud streaked her skirt. Cold climbed to her thighs. Somewhere behind her a man laughed once, and then stopped when she lifted the trunk a second time. She did not look back. Her dark hair had worked free of its pins and lay wet against her neck. Her face, pale and long, drew little kindness in daylight. Men called it plain when they wished to be cruel. Some looked twice before they said so. At the gate she paused only long enough to set the trunk on the low wall and flex her hand. The skin over her knuckles was red and flayed from lye water. She had spent the previous evening rinsing tea linens because the undermaid's child had fever, and no one else would do it quickly enough for Lady Norbury's card party. The soap had stripped her fingers raw. The needle had finished the work. She lifted the trunk again. Her shoulder burned. Her breath smoked in front of her, though it was only autumn rain and not true winter yet. The walk from the yard to Norbury House cut through streets where coal smoke hung low and shop shutters remained bolted. Carts rolled by with milk, fish, charcoal. Bells marked the quarter hour from a church she could not see. She was late. The knowledge pressed on her harder than the trunk. Lady Norbury did not strike often. She preferred language, audience, arrangement. But lateness in wet weather after an errand into town had once earned Eleanor a slap that split the inside of her lip and 2 days without supper for careless pacing. Her mouth still remembered the copper taste when she thought of it. She had not been born to this labour. That fact mattered to no one now except her, and on some mornings not even to her. Her father, Hugh MacDonald, had been a careful man until fever and bad harvests, and one partner's collapse drove him into hurried signatures. Temporary loans, he had said, while smoothing her hair beside the library fire. Bridge notes. We shall recover by spring. Spring had come and gone with his cough deepening. He died in the second week of June, sweating through linen sheets while creditors stood in the hall. Her mother lasted 2 winters after that, quiet and thin, reading by candlelight until the candle failed. Then Lady Norbury entered as guardian and saviour, rustling in silk and rose water, and the house changed its face. Furniture went first. The walnut escritoire where her father had kept county maps vanished in a morning sale. Then portraits, then silver, then books by the crate, except for volumes Lady Norbury deemed decorative, and one pocket dictionary Eleanor hid inside the mattress ticking of her attic bed. Lady Norbury called it prudent management. The servants called it clearing dead weight. Eleanor learned to carry coal, to mend cuffs, to account for sugar spoons she never touched. She became a daughter only on paper and a servant in practice, unpaid and always available. Her stepsisters, Marianne and Felicity, inherited her mother's dressing room and her father's warm south chamber. Eleanor inherited the attic under cracked tiles, where rain tapped all night and frost crept over the wash-basin rim in December. She reached the square just as the sky went from black to iron grey. Norbury House stood with its fan-light glowing amber, proud still despite the pawned pieces. She climbed the steps with water running from her mantle and set the trunk down too softly for relief. Her shoulder shook once. She pushed the door with her hip and entered by the servants' passage, as instructed, though this had once been her front hall too. Heat from the kitchen drifted faintly through stone and smelled of onions and bread she would not taste. Mrs. Davies, the cook, looked up from a chopping block as Eleanor passed. The older woman's eyes moved to the dripping hem, then to Eleanor's hand, then away toward the clock. Sympathy existed in that brief angle of silence. It could not become action. Lady Norbury asked for the parcels 15 minutes ago, said Parker the butler, without turning his head from the ledger in front of him. I have brought them, Eleanor said. You have brought rain upon the floor, she swallowed. I shall wipe it. He closed the book with one finger keeping his place. Now. She set the trunk by the wall, found a rag, and knelt in the passage with water seeping through her skirt a second time. Her knees ached on stone. Her stomach clenched so hard she had to pause once and breathe through her nose until the wave passed. Footmen stepped around her. No one spoke. At last Parker took the trunk and carried it toward the drawing-room. She rose with care, wrung the rag, hung it to dry and reached for the parcels she was to carry in by hand. Her fingers left damp marks on cream paper. From the threshold of the drawing-room she heard laughter and the hiss of logs collapsing inward on the fire. Lady Norbury entertained before noon now, though proper households did not. She liked witnesses for small cruelties. The room was full of silk and perfume and low, practised voices. Marianne sat near the grate in lavender satin, Felicity in blue velvet with jet beads at her throat. 2 neighbouring ladies leaned together over a tray of sugared almonds. Lady Norbury stood nearest the mantel, pale gold gown trimmed in black braid, a spray of winter roses pinned at her breast. Her smile sharpened when she saw Eleanor. There she is, Lady Norbury said. Our household cautionary tale. Eleanor stepped inside and kept her eyes lowered to the carpet border. She held out the parcels. Water dripped from her mantle onto the Aubusson weave. How dutiful, Felicity murmured. And how damp. Marianne laughed. She has soaked herself to save ribbon. Lady Norbury did not take the parcels at once. She looked Eleanor over from boots to hair, and the room waited with that particular stillness wealthy women wore before they enjoyed a scene. You see, she said to her guests, what gratitude looks like in practical form. A girl raised above her station, fed beyond reason, clothed at absurd cost, and yet forever presenting herself as martyrdom in wool. The older of the visiting ladies tilted her head. "Is this your late husband's daughter?" "My late husband's expense," Lady Norbury said, "unmarketable, ungovernable, and ruinously dear." The words landed with the precision of pins. Eleanor felt her face heat despite the cold in her bones. She kept her hands still by force. Her left wrist, where Lady Norbury had caught her 2 nights before for speaking out of turn, showed yellowing bruises beneath the wet cuff. She tucked it inward. Lady Norbury reached forward at last, pinched the edge of Eleanor's mantle between 2 fingers, and held it away from her body as if it smelled offensive. The wool was torn at the seam and mended twice in different thread. "Observe this," she told the room. "One might mistake her for a dock drudge and not a dependent in a respectable house. She does not understand appearances. She never has." Eleanor lifted her gaze then, not to Lady Norbury, but to the fire beyond her, where dry wood burned with bright, indifferent certainty. "The modiste would not release the goods without payment counted in person," she said quietly. "I remained until it was done." Lady Norbury's eyes narrowed. "Did I ask for an explanation?" "No, ma'am." "Then do not offer one." "Yes, ma'am." The guests resumed their murmurs as if a curtain had fallen and risen on schedule. Lady Norbury dropped the mantle edge. It slapped wetly against Eleanor's skirt. "Stand by the door until I dismiss you. You are dripping on my carpet. You may at least serve as warning to the girls." Eleanor moved to the wall beside the tall clock and stood with her back straight, water pooling at her boots, steam rising faintly from wet wool in the heat she could not approach. Silk rustled near the fire. Porcelain touched porcelain. Someone asked about Almack's. Someone praised Marianne's complexion. The hall that had once held her father's voice now held only the sound of people discussing her as an inconvenience between courses. She did not cry. She fixed her eyes on the brass keyhole of the drawing-room door and counted each tick of the clock until her shivering became small enough to hide. She fixed her eyes on the brass keyhole of the drawing-room door and counted each tick of the clock until her shivering became small enough to hide. But the room did not permit even that private discipline for long. Lady Norbury began to speak of accounts, and each word reached Eleanor like sleet through thin cloth. "When my dear husband passed," Lady Norbury said, accepting the tea Marianne poured for her with a smile meant for witnesses, "he left obligations in every direction. Notes against timber, notes against barley, notes against that absurd library no one read." She laughed very lightly, and the women near the fire answered with the same polished sound. "I have spent 3 years converting chaos into order. 3 years. And still I keep his daughter under my roof." One gloved hand lifted in Eleanor's direction, as if indicating a cracked urn that could not be discarded for fear of scandal. "Out of duty, of course." Eleanor held her face still, while the old ache tightened behind her breastbone. Her father had read every evening at the same window until fever took the strength from his hands. He had read aloud from history and medical journals and the poems her mother pretended not to enjoy. He had coughed between pages and apologized for the sound. He had signed papers by candlelight in his final spring because men from London promised him 1 clean season would mend the estate. She had watched his pen tremble over each signature. "Temporary," he had whispered, his voice thin but intent. She heard that word now as Lady Norbury listed recklessness and male vanity before women who had never seen him walk fields at dawn with mud to his knees to inspect failed drainage himself. Felicity reached for a plate of sugared cakes and said, "I cannot imagine inheriting such disorder. Marianne tilted her head toward Eleanor and answered, "One can inherit disorder in many forms." Their bracelets clicked together when they laughed. Eleanor looked at the carpet border again, then at the tea-table legs, and remembered the day those bracelets appeared. They had belonged to her mother. Lady Norbury had called them family pieces, then fastened one on each daughter before the mourning cloth had been removed from the banisters. By 6:30 the fire had burned low enough for the room to cool at the edges, and Lady Norbury turned her gaze upon Eleanor with renewed purpose. "You may fetch more coals," she said, "and do not trail water this time." Eleanor curtsied and moved at once, grateful for motion, if not for mercy. The corridor outside was dim, lit by 2 wall lamps and the blue leak of morning through the stairwell window. Her skirt clung to her calves, heavy as soaked paper. In the coal scullery she knelt, filled the brass bucket, and rose with both hands under the handle to spare her split palm. The raw skin reopened anyway. She felt the sting and kept walking. At the drawing-room threshold, Marianne stopped her with a finger against the bucket rim. "Not there! You are smudging soot on the fender." Eleanor shifted left without reply. Felicity leaned close enough for her perfume to sit in Eleanor's throat like sugar gone sour. "Lady Renshaw asked whether you were truly related to us," she said softly. "I told her blood can run thin." Eleanor set the bucket down and began laying coals, one by one, with the tongs. Behind her, silk moved, and she knew before she turned that Lady Norbury had crossed the room. "Remove that mantle," Lady Norbury said. "You look like a fishwife." Eleanor obeyed. Cold reached her at once through the wet dress beneath. Lady Norbury took the mantle between 2 fingers, examined the worn lining, and gave it to a footman without looking at Eleanor. "Burn this," she said. "It embarrasses me." Eleanor's breath caught before she could steady it. The mantle had been her mother's travelling cloak, cut down and patched. The seam at the shoulder held thread she had sewn with numb hands in the attic last winter, while frost whitened the inside of the panes. "Ma'am," she said, very low, "I can mend it again." Lady Norbury's eyes shifted to her, bright and flat. "You can be silent again." The footman hesitated. His hand tightened on the wool. Then he bowed and carried it away toward the kitchen range. Eleanor returned to the coals. Her fingers shook once when the tongs struck the grate. She thought of the night her mother died and how quickly the house had been rearranged. Marianne had chosen the south chamber before the physician reached the door. Felicity had taken the dressing-table mirror. Lady Norbury had ordered Parker to move Eleanor to the attic before dawn, to preserve propriety. Propriety had meant distance from warmth, from company, from any room where decisions were made. When she had asked for 1 trunk of books, Lady Norbury had answered, "Books do not feed households." By noon the bookseller's cart had stood in the drive, and men she did not know had carried out her father's atlas, her mother's prayer book, the leather volumes that still smelled of pipe smoke and rain. She had kept one thing because she had hidden it first. When the guests finally rose, they left with promises of calls and a trail of compliments that clung to Lady Norbury like powder. The door closed. Silence dropped heavily over the room. Lady Norbury did not dismiss Eleanor. She walked to the escritoire, opened a drawer and removed a sheaf of folded papers bound with blue ribbon. "Come here," she said. Eleanor approached and stopped at the edge of the desk blotter. Up close she could smell rosewater and starch and the faint metallic scent of sealing wax. Lady Norbury untied the ribbon and spread the documents in a precise fan. Promissory notes, interest schedules, a solicitor's summary in a clerk's narrow hand. Her father's signature sat at the bottom of 2 pages, faded but unmistakable. The sight of it made her stomach clench harder than hunger. "You are old enough now to understand figures," Lady Norbury said. "Read line 3. Eleanor read aloud. "Principal amount arrears, penalties assessed." The numbers blurred once before she forced them sharp again. "Read line 7. She did. "And the final column?" She obeyed. The total was larger than the annual income of 3 neighbouring farms together. Lady Norbury folded her hands. "This is what sentiment costs. This is what his weakness cost me. You eat in this house because I permit it despite these liabilities." Eleanor lifted her eyes from the page. "My father was ill. Your father was foolish." Lady Norbury tapped the paper with one ringed finger. "I have delayed legal remedy out of charity and because public ugliness offends me. Do not make me revise that mercy." Felicity entered without knocking, now wearing a garnet brooch Eleanor had once seen in her mother's jewellery case. She held out an envelope. "Mr. Klein's clerk sent this from Lincoln's Inn," she said. Lady Norbury read the first lines and smiled without warmth. How efficient! She set the envelope beside the debt papers and looked back at Eleanor. "You will copy these accounts this afternoon for my records. Every figure, every date. You will not blot the pages as you did in March." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Lady Norbury's gaze dropped to Eleanor's mouth, then to the bruise at her wrist, as if measuring how visible each mark would appear at dinner. "And you will wear cuffs. We are not running a charity ward." Marianne appeared in the doorway behind Felicity, her expression bright with curiosity. "Will she come to supper?" she asked. Lady Norbury gave a short laugh. "If there is enough left." The sisters withdrew together. Their skirts whispered over the hall runner. Lady Norbury gathered the papers back into a neat stack and held out one sheet. "Sign receipt of instruction." Eleanor signed where indicated. Her hand cramped, ink dragging where skin had split across her palm. Lady Norbury blotted the signature and tucked the page away. "Go, dry yourself out of sight." She climbed the narrow back stairs with a stub of candle shielded in her hand, each step familiar as a scar. The attic corridor smelled of damp plaster and old smoke. Wind pushed rain against the tiles overhead in intermittent bursts, then eased, then struck again. Her room was at the far end under the sloped roof, small enough that she could touch both walls standing in the centre, a rope bed, a cracked wash basin, one chair with a loose rung. She set the candle on the sill and peeled wet cuffs from her wrists. The yellowed bruises looked darker in the thin light. Her lower lip had a shallow split from last week, where Lady Norbury's ring had caught her when a tray slipped. It had healed crooked. She bent, drew the mattress edge upward, and reached into the ticking seam until her fingers found the object hidden there. Her father's pocket dictionary, leather-worn smooth at the corners, initials H.M. pressed faintly into the cover. She held it for a moment against her sternum, then opened to the middle where a single folded page lay concealed. It was not money. It was her mother's hand, copied lines from a psalm, and beneath them one sentence added later in hurried ink. "Keep your name whole, even if they take the rest." Eleanor read it twice, then replaced the page and closed the book. Downstairs, laughter flared again from the drawing-room, sharp and bright, followed by the scrape of chairs as servants reset the tables for luncheon she would not see. She washed her hands in cold water that smelled faintly of iron, hissed once when it touched the open cut, and tore a strip from an old petticoat to bind the palm tight enough for writing. At the small chair she set out paper, sharpened a penknife-thin quill, and began to copy the figures that priced her father's ruin in ink and columns, while her own hunger gnawed, steady and unseen. She wrote each number cleanly. She did not blot a line. The numbers marched down the page in disciplined columns, each total cleaner than the life they described, and the scratch of her quill became the only sound in the attic besides rain on tile and the faint clatter of service below. Her fingers cramped. She flexed them once, pressed the bandage tighter around her split palm, and bent again to the ledger copy. Ink, sand, blotting paper, date, sum, interest, penalty. The language of men who never saw the fields they priced. She had nearly reached the final page when footsteps climbed the back stair too quickly for a servant, and too heavily for one of her stepsisters. The tread halted outside her door. No knock. The latch lifted. Parker stood framed in the narrow opening, dry and formal, in black coat and white stock, as if rain and kitchens and human urgency did not apply to him. Behind his shoulder a thin man in a solicitor's clerk's grey waited with a leather case under one arm and droplets still clinging to his hat brim. Lady Norbury's scent entered before she did, rose water and powdered iris, then the rustle of silk as she stepped into the room and looked around with visible displeasure at the low ceiling, the cracked basin, the candle guttering by the pane. Marianne and Felicity remained in the corridor watching. Lady Norbury held out an envelope sealed in dark green wax. "Mr. Klein's office has become tired of delay," she said. "You will read this now in front of witnesses, so there can be no later invention." Eleanor rose, chair legs scraping the boards, and took the envelope with fingers that had gone suddenly cold despite the close air. Her name was written across the front in a hand she did not know, Miss Eleanor MacDonald, dependent at Norbury House. The clerk cleared his throat and opened his case. "Madame instructed me to certify delivery," he said, "and verbal notice." Lady Norbury gave a small nod. "Proceed." The clerk drew out a folded sheet and read in a monotone too practised for shame. "By instruction of the acting household administrator and legal guardian, you are ordered to vacate the premises of Norbury House by nightfall this date. Any personal effects not removed by that hour shall be deemed forfeited in lieu of outstanding obligations inherited under the estate of Hugh MacDonald." His eyes skimmed downward. "Failure to comply will result in transfer to creditor, custody pending settlement procedures." The words struck harder than any slap. Custody, settlement, as if she were a crate to be seized. Eleanor broke the wax with her thumb and read the same order in black ink, this time with Lady Norbury's signature beneath the clerk's notation, and a list of charges appended in the margin: board, instruction, clothing, medical attendance, corrective expenses. Corrective. She looked up. "These charges are false." Lady Norbury's mouth curved very slightly. "These charges are filed." Marianne laughed softly in the hall. Felicity leaned against the frame, bracelets bright at her wrist. "Perhaps she may seek work mending sails," Felicity said. "She is already dressed for docks." Lady Norbury did not glance at her daughters. Her gaze remained on Eleanor's face, intent and hard. "Pack what you can carry. You have until sunset. If you attempt to remove house property, Parker will stop you. If you attempt to appeal in public, I will produce those account pages with your own hand, copied beneath my supervision. Do not force me to make ugliness of this. You have always lacked talent for winning." Eleanor's throat tightened until speech scraped. "My father left a trust for me." "Your father left debt." Lady Norbury stepped closer, close enough that Eleanor could see powder settled in the fine lines at the corners of her lips. "And now he has left you consequence." The clerk extended a second page. "Signature of receipt, miss." Eleanor stared at the line where her name waited. For one breath she nearly refused. Then she saw Parker watching with a satisfaction so slight it was almost invisible. and she signed because refusal would not void ink, only feed it. The quill trembled once. She set it down. Lady Norbury took the page and folded it with exact care. "By this evening," she said, "or I send you under warrant." She turned, Silk whispering against the doorframe. The others shifted to follow. Then, from the street below, a child screamed. It was a high, tearing sound, abrupt and animal, followed at once by the shatter of wood and a horse's panicked shriek. A wheel struck stone. Something heavy hit the pavement with a crack that silenced the corridor for half a heartbeat. Eleanor was already moving. The order remained clenched in her fist as she reached the stair. She did not look back for permission. Lady Norbury called her name sharply, then again with command sharpened to fury. But another cry rose from outside, weaker this time, and Eleanor flew down the back steps 2 at a time, skirt gathered, candle smoke and rose water and legal threat all swallowed by the thunder of blood in her ears. She burst into the service hall, crossed the flagstones and shouldered through the side door into rain that stung like sleet. The square had ruptured into motion. A black carriage stood at an angle near the curb. One shaft split, one horse rearing against its traces with white-rimmed eyes, while a groom fought for the bridle and slipped in mud. A crowd had formed in the swift, useless way of London crowds. People pressed beneath awnings and parasols, staring, murmuring, no one stepping into the spray of hooves. On the stones beside the near wheel lay a boy in a dark coat, no larger than Thomas Parker's son from the Kitchens, his leg trapped beneath the rim where the carriage had lurched over him. He clawed at the cobbles, face drained of colour, breath coming in short, frightened bursts. Beside him, one knee in the mud, a tall man in a greatcoat darkened almost black from rain, and something darker at the shoulder braced both hands under the carriage frame and lifted with a raw, contained force that shook his arms, but did not move the full weight enough. His jaw was set hard as quarried stone. Water streamed from his hair and down his cheek. His eyes were fixed on the boy with a focus that looked like fury and fear braided together. "Hold him still," the man ordered, without looking up. No one obeyed. Eleanor did. She dropped to the stones at the child's shoulders, ignoring the water soaking through her sleeves, and caught his wrists before he could thrash the trapped leg deeper. "Look at me," she said. "Look at me, not the wheel." He tried and failed, eyes wild, breath hitching. She scanned the ground, saw an iron bar half hidden under splintered shaft wood, seized it and jammed one end under the wheel hub. "When I say now, lift again," she said to the man. He glanced at her then, a hard, assessing look that took in her bare head, wet dress, and blood-striped bandage in less than a second. "Move back," he said. "You will be crushed." "Lift on my count," she snapped, and shoved the bar lower for leverage. "Now!" He lifted, muscles locked under soaked wool. The carriage rose 1 inch, then 2, the wheels shuddering in the rut. Eleanor drove down on the iron with all her weight. Mud slid under her boots. The boy cried out once, sharp and broken, and she dragged his leg clear by the calf and hauled him across the stones toward her. The wheel slammed back down. The sound cracked through the rain. The horse jolted, and the groom finally got the bit under control. For a moment no one moved. Then the boy gasped, a full breath this time, and clutched at Eleanor's sleeve. "It hurts," he whispered. "I know," she said. "Stay with me." The tall man was beside them at once. Up close he was broader than he had seemed through the chaos. Rain and grime streaked across a face cut in severe planes, a narrow scar fading from temple toward cheekbone. Blood had soaked the fabric at his left shoulder, not pouring, but enough to spread through the cloth in a dark fan. He pressed fingers to the boy's throat, checking pulse with practiced certainty, then to the trapped leg, quick and careful. "Can you feel this?" he asked the child. The boy nodded and winced. The man exhaled once, controlled. "Good." A coachman pushed through the onlookers. "Your Grace, the horse shied at the barrel. I could not—" "Later," the man said. "One word, flat, final. Your Grace." The crowd seemed to hear it all at once. The murmurs shifted. Hats dipped. A woman under an umbrella whispered the name aloud, and it rippled outward with the rain. Vale. Duke Vale. Alistair Vale returned from the North Campaign, widower, member of the Lords, the man newspapers praised for iron nerve and criticised for having none of the softness expected by drawing rooms. Eleanor had seen engravings, never the person. The engravings had not captured the force of him in motion, or the cold precision in his voice. He turned to her fully then, and his gaze dropped from her face to the paper crushed in her fist, to the cuff pulled back from her bruised wrist, then to her mouth where the old split had healed crooked. Nothing in his expression altered, yet she felt seen with a severity that made her want to step back and stand her ground in the same instant. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eleanor MacDonald." He repeated it once, as if testing the shape. "Miss MacDonald, keep pressure here." He placed her hand just above the boy's ankle, exact and steady despite blood wetting his sleeve. "Not on the joint! Above it!" She obeyed. "He needs warmth and quiet. No spirits." His eyes flicked to hers again. "You have training?" "My father read medicine. I read what he read." A muscle moved once in his jaw. "You read well under pressure." She almost laughed at the absurdity of praise in a gutter, but the boy flinched and she kept her attention on him. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked the child. "Thomas," he whispered. "Thomas, breathe with me. Slow in, out." He mirrored her, shuddering. The Duke signalled to 2 footmen who had finally forced their way through the crowd. "Lift him together. Level. If you jar that leg, you answer to me." They swallowed and nodded. He removed his greatcoat despite the rain, folded it, and slid it under Thomas's shoulders before the men raised him, using his own body as shield from the splash of wheels and boots. The gesture was efficient, almost harsh. It was also tenderness stripped of ornament. As the footman carried Thomas toward the waiting carriage, Eleanor rose too fast, dizziness punching through her vision. She steadied on the broken shaft. The eviction order, soaked now, stuck to her palm. She did not realize she had spoken until the words were in the rain between them. "I cannot leave with you." The Duke had been issuing instructions to his coachman. He turned back at once. "I did not invite you to promenade." "I cannot leave this square. I am under notice." She held up the sodden paper. "If I am absent by evening, I am to be taken for debt." His hand extended. "Give me that." She hesitated one beat, then surrendered the page. He read quickly, despite rain running over the ink, eyes narrowing at the seal, the signature, the phrasing. "This is coercive rubbish dressed as legality." "It is filed," she said, hearing Lady Norbury's voice in her own and hating it. He looked from the paper to her face. "You are shaking." "It is rain. It is hunger," he said. "And cold." "And shock. Do not lie to me when a child nearly died in your hands." Heat rose under her skin despite the weather. "I am not asking alms, Your Grace." "Good." His voice did not soften. "I am not offering alms." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see rain caught on his lashes, and the strain he still kept locked in his shoulders. "My son requires a letters tutor by tonight. His governess left last month. You will come with us. You will be paid in coin before midnight. If you choose to walk away at dawn, no gate in my house will close behind you." She stared at him. "Why?" "Because he listened to your voice when he would not listen to mine." A beat passed. because you moved while everyone else watched." Around them, the square had resumed its restless noise, wheels cutting through standing water, people pretending not to listen while listening to every word. Eleanor felt the weight of those eyes, the weight of the order no longer in her hand, the weight of sunset approaching like a blade. Behind her, at the top of Norbury House steps, Lady Norbury had appeared in the doorway under the portico, silk bright against shadow, face sharpened with outrage at seeing Eleanor in the street and not under command. Even at this distance, Eleanor could read the shape of her mouth forming her name like accusation. The Duke followed Eleanor's glance once and saw the woman at the door. His expression flattened further, if that was possible. He handed the order to his valet without turning his head. "Keep this dry. I want a copy made before luncheon." Then he looked at Eleanor and gave the command again, quieter this time, leaving no space for theatre. "Come." For one breath she heard only rain on harness and the ragged pull of Thomas's breathing from inside the carriage. Then she gathered her soaked skirts, lifted her chin toward the house that had just expelled her, and stepped toward the Duke's coach. She reached the carriage before fear could drag her back toward the portico and all the old habits that had kept her alive there. A footman opened the door. Warmth rushed out, mixed with wet wool, leather, and the metallic scent of blood. Thomas lay across the seat, with his head in the valet's lap, one small hand twisted in the lining of the coat the Duke had placed under him. His lashes were clumped with rain. His mouth trembled, though he did not cry now. Eleanor climbed in after him, without waiting to be invited, gathered her soaked skirt clear of his injured leg, and set 2 fingers to his wrist. "Stay awake," she said softly. "Look at me, Thomas." His eyes found her and held. "Do not let him leave." The words were not for pain. They were for terror. She looked up. The Duke stood in the street beside the wheel, one hand braced on the frame, rain running down the hard line of his face. For a second he looked not like a peer of the realm, but like a man standing on a battlefield and counting what remained. "I am here," he told the boy. Then he stepped up and entered opposite Eleanor. Too large for the confined space, shoulders filling the carriage as if the vehicle had been built around him, and no one else. He struck the roof once with his gloved hand. The coach lurched forward. London slid past in jolting fragments, blurred windows, open drains, tradesmen flattening themselves against walls as Vale livery cut through traffic. Every rut jarred Thomas. Every jolt sent strain through his jaw and made his breath hitch higher in his chest. Eleanor slid closer and braced his knee between both palms to steady the injured limb without pressing the joint. The Duke watched her hands once, then shifted his own boot beneath the boy's ankle to support it when the carriage pitched. "You know fractures," he said. "I know enough to avoid making one worse." He gave a short nod. "Dr. Harrow is already on his way." Thomas clutched her sleeve again. "It hurts." "Yes," she said. "Breathe anyway. Slow. In for 4. She counted. He followed, ragged but obedient. Across from her, the Duke's gaze fixed on his son's face with a stillness so complete it looked like restraint hammered into shape over years. His left shoulder had bled through shirt and coat. The stains spread with each minute. "You are injured," she said before she could stop herself. He did not look away from Thomas. "Later." "Later may be stupid." His eyes flicked to hers at that. Cold, dark, alert. Then, unexpectedly, his mouth shifted one fraction at one corner. Not quite a smile. Not mockery either. A recognition. "Attend the patient in front of you, Miss MacDonald." She almost answered that he was bleeding onto his own carriage cushions, and that rank did not alter physiology, but Thomas made a small choking sound, and she bent again, stroking the child's damp hair back from his forehead. The coach swayed hard around a corner. She pressed his shoulders gently until the shaking passed. By the time they reached Grosvenor Square, the sky had lifted from black to a flat pewter grey. Vale House rose behind iron gates, broad-faced and severe, all pale stone and dark windows that reflected the storm. The carriage had barely halted before doors opened in a disciplined wave. Footmen, a housekeeper in charcoal silk, 2 grooms, a maid with blankets already in her arms. The household had heard wheels and read urgency from distance. They moved quickly, but no one moved without looking first to the Duke. "Blue room," he ordered. "Fire now, dry linen, Mrs. Ellis, no one enters unless Miss MacDonald allows it. Mr. Finch, send for Harrow again. If he's not mounted in 2 minutes, fetch Merrick." Every command landed clean. Every servant obeyed at once. Thomas whimpered as they lifted him. Eleanor went with him down the long corridor lined with portraits that watched without mercy, men in velvet and women in pearls who had never carried a hurt child through their own hall. The blue room was warm before they crossed the threshold. Coal snapped in the grate. A narrow bed had been cleared. Eleanor stripped off her wet gloves, cut away Thomas's boot with scissors a maid handed her, and examined the swelling at his ankle, while he gripped the bed cover and gasped through his teeth. "No rotation," she murmured. "Good. You did not lose sensation in the street." A maid hovered with a basin. "Miss, shall I fetch laudanum?" "Not yet. Cloth and cold water first, and 2 boards the length of his forearm, smooth edges." The maid stared once, then ran. The Duke entered with his coat off and shirt sleeve dark to the elbow. Mrs. Ellis followed and stopped short at the blood. "Your Grace, not now." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Now," she said. Silence struck the room. Even Thomas stopped whimpering for a beat. No one spoke to a duke in that tone under his own roof. She heard what she had done and expected the cut of reprimand. Instead, he walked to the washstand, poured water over his left shoulder one-handed, and watched her over the rim of the basin as diluted red ran into porcelain. "Instructions?" he asked. She swallowed once. "Pressure. Clean cloth. Sit down before you fall." He handed the cloth to Mrs. Ellis and sat, without argument, in the chair nearest the bed, as if command translated in both directions when necessity demanded it. The housekeeper's brows lifted almost imperceptibly. Then she began binding his shoulder with practised hands. "Doctor." Harrow arrived within the quarter hour, rein on his hat, case buckled shut, expression prepared for authority and inconvenience. He was middle-aged, whiskered, and already speaking before he fully entered. "I came as soon as—" He saw Eleanor at the bedside, sleeves rolled, palms steady on improvised splints. "Who is this?" "Miss MacDonald," the Duke said. "She removed him from under a carriage wheel. You will listen to her observations before you speak." The physician's mouth flattened. "As you wish, Your Grace." Eleanor gave him the sequence plainly. Trapped duration, position, breathing pattern in transit. No loss of consciousness. She described the swelling and tenderness points, the refusal of weight-bearing, the absence of visible deformity. Harrow examined the leg, pressed, watched Thomas's pupils, and at last exhaled through his nose. "Sprain with probable hairline fracture near the fibula," he said. "Splinting was correct. We shall keep him quiet for 3 weeks." She stepped back at once to give him room. He mixed tincture and measured drops with careful fingers. Thomas turned his face toward Eleanor, as if she were the fixed point in a room suddenly crowded by adults. She took his hand again and did not notice the Duke watching that small motion until Mrs. Ellis shifted at his side. Harrow glanced toward her while bandaging. "You have worked in an infirmary?" "No." "Who taught you to assess like that?" She tied off the final strip and smoothed it once. "My father taught me to read what matters first." The doctor gave a brief nod that held more respect than warmth. "Then your father taught usefully." Thomas drifted at last under the edge of medicine and exhaustion, breath easing into a slower rhythm. The room settled. Rain tapped the tall windows in a softer pattern now, as if the storm had spent itself against stone. Eleanor became aware of her own body again, the chill clinging to her spine, wet stockings, hunger scraping hollow under her ribs. She rose and nearly swayed. Mrs. Ellis reached for her elbow. "You will sit," the housekeeper said quietly. "I am well." "You are grey." Before Eleanor could refuse again, a tray appeared at her side, as if summoned by thought. Broth, bread, tea, and a dry shawl. She looked from the tray to Mrs. Ellis and then to the Duke. He had not moved from the chair by Thomas's bed. His cuff was rolled. Fresh bandage crossed his shoulder under torn shirtcloth. He did not look at her when he spoke. "Eat." It was a command. It was also the first time in years anyone had given food to her before leftovers cooled. She took the cup because refusing would be theatre, and she had no strength left for theatre. The broth burned her tongue and steadied her knees. She drank slowly and kept her eyes on Thomas. No one commented on the speed with which she finished the bread. An hour after midday, Thomas woke in a frightened start, clawing at the blanket as if the wheel still pinned him. He tried to sit. Pain caught him and he cried out. Harrow had left by then, with written directions. The footman outside the door stepped in, uncertain and pale. "Shall I fetch his Grace?" Eleanor was already beside the bed. "No shouting. Bring me the slate and chalk from the schoolroom and a bowl of cool water." Thomas's breaths came too fast, each one shallow and sharp. Panic, she thought, not new pain alone. She leaned close so he did not have to lift his head to see her. "Thomas, listen. You are in your house. You are safe. Put your hand on mine." He did, fingers cold and damp. "Good. Now we count objects. 5 blue things." His gaze darted wild across the room, then fixed where she pointed. "Curtain, chair, ribbon, book spine." He swallowed. "Your eyes." She blinked. 4 is enough. Now 4 sounds. He listened. Rain. Fire. Clock. His own breath. 3 touches, she said. "Sheet, pillow, my sleeve." The rhythm pulled him down from the ledge where terror had carried him. By the time the slate arrived, the shaking had eased. She sat on the rug by the bed and drew letters in chalk with deliberate strokes. "Tea," she said. "For Thomas. For today. For the truth that you were brave." He copied her with careful concentration, tongue between his teeth. His lines were crooked. She praised the effort, not the shape. He looked up once, searching her face with the solemnity children used when deciding whether an adult could be trusted. "Will father be angry that I cried?" "No, he does not cry. That is his business. Breathing is yours." A low sound came from the doorway. She turned. The Duke stood just beyond the threshold, one hand on the frame, coat changed, cravat loosened, expression unreadable. He must have been there for several moments. He had heard enough to know what Thomas asked and how she answered. "I can leave," she said, rising halfway. "Sit," he said. She sat. He crossed to the bed, touched Thomas's hair once, awkwardly, as if the movement belonged to another language he had learned long ago and then forgotten. Thomas leaned into the touch for one breath and then looked back to the slate. The Duke's hand remained where it was an instant longer than necessary before he withdrew. "You wrote well," he told the boy. Thomas lifted the slate with solemn pride. Miss MacDonald says truth first. The Duke's eyes moved to Eleanor. Sensibly said. He did not add praise. He did not need to. The words settled with more weight because they were spare. A knock sounded at the outer door. Finch, the valet from the street, entered and bowed. Your Grace, Lady Norbury's carriage has come to the gate. She requests immediate audience regarding Miss MacDonald and claims legal authority over her person. Thomas stiffened at the change in adult voices. Eleanor felt the day tilt back toward danger with sick precision. Of course Lady Norbury had followed. Predators did not surrender property because property stepped into better light. The Duke did not turn from the bed. What papers does she present? A household guardianship declaration and a demand for surrendered wages. Keep her in the outer drawing room. She waits. Finch hesitated. She is not inclined to wait, Your Grace. Then she may discover inclination. The valet bowed and withdrew. Eleanor stood. If I have brought scandal to your door, I can go now. The Duke faced her fully. In the firelight his features seemed carved from weathered stone, severe and controlled, but his voice came lower than before. You have brought my son breathing into this house. You will not apologize for that. She will accuse you of theft. She is welcome to accuse. She will accuse me of lying. His gaze dropped to her wrist where bruises darkened beneath fresh cuffs Mrs. Ellis had given her, then to the fading split at her lip. She already does, he said. Truth did not begin this war. Truth will end it. The certainty in him should have frightened her. Instead, it steadied something that had been shaking for years. He moved to the escritoire by the window and opened a drawer Eleanor had not noticed earlier. From it he drew a small iron key on a plain ring, old, dark, worn smooth at the bow by another hand long gone. He held it out across the narrow distance between them. If Thomas wakes frightened, again take him to the north room, he said. No one enters it, no one argues with me. The key lay in his palm like a verdict. Eleanor did not take it at once. She understood houses. She understood forbidden doors and the cost of crossing them. Behind his shoulder, Thomas watched with heavy-lidded eyes, clutching the chalk in one fist as if it were a charm against pain. From beyond the corridor came the faint echo of raised voices at the front of the house, silk anger pressing against oak and protocol. At last she placed her hand beneath his and accepted the key. It was colder than she expected. I will go where he needs to breathe, she said. His fingers closed over hers for one brief second, not tender, not possessive, only absolute in intent. Good, he said. Then he turned toward the door and the waiting storm in his drawing room, while Eleanor slipped the forbidden key into her pocket and went back to the child. Thomas had begun tracing the edge of the slate with his thumb when the first raised voice rolled up from the front of the house. It came through floorboards and plaster as a muffled blade, sharpened by indignation and perfume, and Eleanor knew Lady Norbury's cadence before she could distinguish a word. She kept her face still and set fresh chalk in the child's hand. Another tea, she said, slowly. He swallowed and obeyed line by careful line. His breathing had steadied, but each sound from below pulled his shoulders higher toward his ears. At the third burst of argument, he looked at the door. Is someone angry? Yes, Eleanor said, because children heard falsehood as quickly as fear. But not with you. Will father send you away? The question landed harder than she expected. She could not answer it with certainty, and she had promised herself she would not give a frightened child borrowed comfort. She turned the slate so he could see the letters he had already made. Write your name again, she said softly. "We will talk while you write." His small hand shook once, then steadied. "T-H-O!" Downstairs, a man's voice cut through the house in a low, decisive line. She could not hear the words, only the force. The argument did not end. Lady Norbury answered louder. A door opened, closed. Footsteps crossed marble. Eleanor rose and checked the splint straps at Thomas's ankle, still firm. No swelling beyond what Harrow had marked. She adjusted the blanket and touched his forehead with the back of her fingers. Warm, not burning. His lashes fluttered. "Rest now," he caught her sleeve. "Do not go far." "I will be at the chair." She sat beside the bed, hands folded in her lap so he would not see the tremor she had suppressed since the square. Her wet dress had been changed for one of Mrs. Ellis's plain gowns in dark grey wool, too broad in the shoulders and too short in the wrists. The borrowed cloth scratched her skin. The room smelled of coal, lavender water, and medicine. Somewhere in the corridor a clock ticked with precise indifference. The voices below rose once more, then stopped so abruptly the silence felt deliberate. A few minutes later Finch appeared at the threshold, pale but composed. "Miss MacDonald, His Grace asks if the boy is settled?" "He is." Finch glanced toward Thomas, then lowered his voice. "Lady Norbury insists upon speaking to you directly. His Grace has refused. She is now threatening publication of certain slanders in the morning papers." Thomas stirred at the change in tone. Eleanor stood and stepped into the corridor, drawing the door nearly closed behind her. "I will go down," she said. "This is my quarrel." Finch's expression did not shift, but something like pity moved behind it. "His Grace anticipated that answer. He instructed me to say no." She felt heat climb into her face despite the chill in the passage. "I cannot remain upstairs while he bears damage on my account." "Miss MacDonald," Finch said quietly, "with respect, damage arrived with her carriage, not with you." Before she could reply, another footman approached at speed and bent toward Finch's ear. The man whispered. Finch gave one curt nod and dismissed him. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "His Grace requests your presence in the west drawing-room. Immediately. Bring the key." Her hand went to her pocket at once. Cold iron pressed her fingertips through the wool. She looked back at the blue room door. "Mrs. Ellis is with the child," Finch said. "He will not wake alone." She followed him down the long staircase, where portraits watched from gilded frames and candles burned steady against the rain-dark afternoon. The west drawing-room was smaller than the formal salon, panelled in walnut, with shelves of law reports and dispatch boxes lining one wall. A fire burned low. The scent of wet wool and rose-water still lingered. Lady Norbury stood near the centre table in travelling silk the colour of clotted cream, hat askew from agitation, gloves darkened at the fingertips where rain had reached them. Marianne and Felicity waited behind her like mirrored ornaments, bright-eyed, cold-mouthed. 2 Vale House guards stood by the door, not touching, not yielding. Alistair Vale stood by the mantel with one hand braced on the stone. He had changed his shirt, but the new linen pulled tight over fresh bandage at his shoulder. He did not look at Lady Norbury when Eleanor entered. He looked at Eleanor. "Close the door," he said. Finch obeyed. Lady Norbury turned at once, voice sharpened to public injury. "There she is. Eleanor, tell His Grace you are bound to my household until obligations are satisfied. Tell him you entered this house under false pretences and that any wages are mine by law." Eleanor opened her mouth, but Alistair spoke first. "You will address Miss MacDonald with civility," he said, "or you will not address her at all." Lady Norbury gave a thin laugh. Your Grace mistakes firmness for incivility. The girl is my legal dependent. Alistair held out one sheet of paper. Your guardianship declaration is unsigned by the parish magistrate and witnessed by your own steward. Invalid. A second sheet. Your debt schedule includes charges for educational instruction during years in which no tutor was retained. Fraudulent. A third. Your demand for surrendered wages assumes bonded service. There is no bond. Lady Norbury's colour changed by degrees, from powdered calm to blotched fury. These are private family matters. They ceased to be private when you attempted coercive seizure under my gate. She drew herself up, silk rustling like dry leaves. Do you comprehend what scandal you invite? A duke sheltering a dismissed girl from a respectable widow. The town will have sport with this. The town has had sport with her long enough. It was said without heat. It struck harder for that. He turned then, finally, and looked directly at Eleanor. His gaze moved over her face, her hands, the cuffs unable to conceal old bruising, the worn seams of the borrowed dress where it could not disguise her thinness. His voice stayed level. You have eaten one bowl of broth today. Your boots were letting water before dawn. You have open cuts on both hands and healing injuries older than this week. You were evicted without lawful order and threatened with custody to force compliance. He paused. I have been watching since the square. I do not miss much. The room held still around the words. Marianne looked away first. Felicity's mouth tightened, then softened with something that might have been calculation and was not remorse. Eleanor felt as if her skin had been turned inside out. No one had ever named what was done to her in front of witnesses and called it by its true weight. Shame burned, then shifted into something steadier and more dangerous. Lady Norbury took one sharp step forward. You presume too far, Your Grace. She is ungrateful, deceitful, and prone to dramatics. I have corrected her where needed. Any marks are of her own clumsiness. Stop, Alistair said. One word, not loud, final as iron. Lady Norbury halted. Even she heard the edge beneath it. He moved from the mantel to the writing table and took up a prepared page. Miss MacDonald. Eleanor stepped closer, uncertain. This is a temporary contract of employment as tutor companion to my son, effective immediately, with wages paid directly to you each week in coin and recorded by my solicitor. It includes board, private chamber, and legal protection under my household while the contract stands. He set a small leather purse beside the paper. It landed with a heavy sound. First week in advance. Lady Norbury made an incredulous sound. You cannot be serious. Alistair did not look up. I am always serious. He indicated the line for signature with the end of his pen. Read it. Eleanor read every clause twice. No hidden deductions. No surrender of movement, no transfer of wages. A right to terminate with 2 days' notice from either side. Her throat tightened unexpectedly at the plainness of that fairness. If I sign, she said, you will be accused of purchasing scandal. He met her gaze. If you do not sign, she will attempt to drag you out by sunset. Choose the danger you prefer. The choice was no choice, and yet wholly hers. She took the pen. Her hand shook once, then steadied as she wrote, Elena MacDonald. Alistair signed beneath her with clean, decisive strokes, and sanded the ink. Finch, he said, without turning, escort Lady Norbury and her daughters to their carriage. They are not to re-enter this house without written appointment. Lady Norbury stared at him as if he had spoken in another language. You dare! Yes, you will regret this. He folded the contract copy and handed it to Eleanor. I regret delay. For one suspended beat, Lady Norbury seemed poised to strike or spit or throw the nearest object. Instead, she drew in one hard breath and arranged her face into injured dignity. "Come!" she snapped to her daughters. Marianne passed Eleanor with her chin high and eyes brittle. Felicity lingered a fraction longer, gaze flicking to the purse, the signed paper, the key-shaped outline in Eleanor's pocket. Then she followed her mother out. The door closed behind silk and anger and wet perfume. No one spoke until the sound of carriage wheels rolled away beyond the gates. By the time the corridor clock struck 3, the storm had thinned to a fine grey rain that traced the windows in narrow lines. Eleanor remained standing beside the writing table, contract in one hand, purse untouched in the other, as if movement would break whatever law had just shifted around her. Alistair's shoulders lowered a degree that could only be read by someone already watching too closely. He crossed to the sideboard, poured water, and drank with his right hand while keeping his left arm close against the bandaged shoulder. "You should sit," Eleanor said. "You should sit," he returned. Neither moved. At last she set the purse down. "You did not need to do this." "Yes, I did. For Thomas, perhaps." "For Thomas," he said. Then, after a beat, "and for accuracy." She frowned slightly. "Accuracy. I prefer the correct name for things." His eyes held hers unblinking, storm-dark in the dim room. "What was done to you was not management. It was abuse of dependency. I will not host it under my roof." No one had ever said the word aloud to her face. Abuse, not correction, not burden, not household discipline. The room seemed to tilt and steady again. "I do not require rescue, Your Grace," she said, quietly but clear. His expression did not soften, but something in it altered, a small relinquishing of distance. "Good! I did not offer rescue. I offered terms and enforcement." He glanced toward the corridor that led to Thomas's room. "You accepted terms. I enforce." There it was, the crack, not tenderness, not declaration. A line crossed and marked in permanent ink. He set the water glass down with controlled care and reached into his coat. When his hand emerged, another key lay across his palm, longer than the first, brass at the bow, worn nearly white. "The inner bolt to the north room," he said. "The iron key opens the door. This one locks it from within." "Use both tonight?" Eleanor stared at the key, then at him. "Against whom?" "Anyone who mistakes silence for consent." His gaze dropped briefly to her split knuckles, then rose again. "If any person in this house enters without your permission, you are come directly to me. If I am not in the house, you send for me. If they tell you not to disturb me, you send anyway." "Your Grace," he cut across her with the same controlled force he had used in the square. "No argument." The words should have felt like command alone. Instead, they landed as shelter, plain and unadorned. She extended her hand. He placed the second key in her palm and closed her fingers over it, just as he had with the first. His touch lasted one heartbeat longer than form required. Not possession. Seal. From upstairs came a small cry, Thomas's voice breaking on her name. Eleanor moved at once. Alistair moved too, and for a moment they reached the door together, shoulder to shoulder, neither yielding, neither ahead. He stepped back, half a pace, and gestured for her to go first. In the blue room, Thomas was half upright, breath fast, eyes unfocused with pain and bad dreams. Eleanor sat on the bed and took his hand. Alistair stood at the foot, very still, one hand on the carved post so tightly the knuckles whitened. He did not issue orders. He did not pace. He held his ground as if motion might fracture whatever fragile calm she was building. "Thomas," Eleanor said, "find my voice." The child turned toward her and caught it. She counted breaths, then sounds, then objects until the panic loosened. He clung to her sleeve and whispered, "Do not leave when it is dark." "I will not," she said. Alistair's jaw tightened once. The scar at his temple pulled faintly with the movement. When Thomas drifted again, Eleanor began to rise, intending to fetch the cooling cloth, but Alistair had already crossed the room and returned with basin and linen before she asked. He set them beside her without a word and resumed his post, still as the stone outside. Minutes passed. Then more. Firelight shifted lower on the walls. Mrs. Ellis entered once with tea and withdrew when she saw the arrangement and understood it did not require interruption. The house settled toward evening around that small circle of bed, chair, and watchful silence. At last Thomas slept deeply, one hand still fisted in the blanket, breath even at last. Eleanor eased back in her chair, exhausted through bone and skin. Across from her, Alistair remained standing, despite the bandage at his shoulder, despite the long day, eyes on the child, and then, briefly, on her. "You may go," she whispered. "He is safe for now." He looked at Thomas again, then at the keys in her lap, iron and brass catching ember light. "I said no one argues with me," he murmured. "That includes you." He drew the second chair closer to the bed and sat without removing his gaze from his son. He did not move again. And the room held that stillness so long that the fire dropped to embers before either of them spoke. Thomas woke just after midnight with his hands at his throat, breath snagging and eyes wide with the blind terror of pain. He tried to wrench himself upright. The splintered leg shifted. He cried out once, then bit it back. Eleanor was at the bed before the sound had faded. Alistair was there on her other side, one hand bracing the child's shoulders, the other frozen above him, as if force could not solve this, and he knew it. "North room," Eleanor said. Alistair nodded once. "Take him." She slid one arm under Thomas's back and one beneath his knees, careful of the splint. He was light and burning hot through the linen nightshirt. At the corridor threshold, 2 footmen saw where she was turning and stopped dead. "Miss!" one whispered, shaken. "That room is not—" "The key!" Alistair said. Eleanor had it ready in her pocket, the iron bit into her palm as she fit it to the lock. The door opened with a low scrape and the smell of shut air, cedar, and old lavender. She carried Thomas to the chaise by the hearth and laid him down. Alistair followed, closed the door, and turned the inner brass bolt himself before stepping back. He drew the brass key from the bolt and pressed it into Eleanor's hand. The room had been preserved like a held breath. A shawl still hung over the back of a chair. A closed pianoforte stood near the far wall, dust traced only where a hand had once gripped its edge. On the desk sat an inkstand gone dry. No servant had entered to disturb any of it. Thomas clawed at his collar again, panicked by his own breathing. Eleanor tore a strip from the hem of her shift, dipped it in water from the ewer, and cooled his neck and wrists. "Look at me," she said. "In, out, slower." He could not. She began the Highland lullaby her mother had sung in hard winters, low and steady, the old vowels soft as wool. Thomas's breath followed her voice by degrees. In the doorway, Alistair went still as carved stone. When Thomas's pulse settled under her fingers, Eleanor rose to find fresh linen. She opened the lower drawer of the late Duchess's desk and found it locked. The brass key lay warm in her other hand from the bolt. On instinct, she tried it. The drawer turned open. Inside was a bundle of ledgers tied with a black ribbon, a folded codicil wrapped in oilskin, and beneath it a signet impression she knew at once. H.M., her father's seal pressed into red wax, now gone dark with years. Her throat tightened. She broke the fold with shaking care. The codicil named a trust in her favour, separate from estate debt, with 2 witnesses and one addendum in a different hand documenting transfer authority to no guardian without parish confirmation. Lady Norbury's claims had never been lawful. She did not sit down. She carried the packets straight to Alistair. He read by candlelight while Thomas drifted in exhausted sleep behind them. The scar at Alistair's temple whitened as his jaw tightened. He read the pages twice, then handed the codicil back to her with deliberate care, as if passing something breakable and consequential. "Finch copied the eviction order," he said quietly. "I sent him to my solicitor at 2:00. I sent him again at dawn with these." "I could keep them," Eleanor said. "Take my money and leave." "You could." His eyes held hers. "Will you?" She looked at Thomas, then at the desk where another woman's life had been sealed away, then at the seal in her hand with her father's initials clear and small. "No." "Good," he said. "Truth in court, not bargains in shadows." By breakfast, rain had thinned to a pale mist against the glass. Eleanor wore one of Mrs. Ellis's plain morning gowns, cuffs high to hide bruises, her father's dictionary tucked into her pocket beside the codicil. Thomas slept in the north room with Mrs. Ellis nearby and the door left unlatched at his request. Alistair had not gone to bed. He stood at the breakfast table as Finch laid out copied documents in ordered stacks. The soaked eviction order transcribed and certified, the guardianship declaration, the false debt schedules, the ledgers from the desk, the codicil. At 9, after Finch announced them, and by Alistair's explicit instruction that they be admitted only under guard escort for formal reply, Lady Norbury entered, silk rustling and fury barely powdered over. Marianne and Felicity followed, both pale. 2 guards stood behind them at Alistair's instruction. "You have stolen private papers," Lady Norbury said. "You will return them now." Alistair did not offer her a chair. "You filed false claims and attempted coercive seizure." "Absurd!" Eleanor stepped forward and set the codicil on the table. "My father's seal is here. So is the trust record. You knew." Lady Norbury's gaze snapped to the page. For one exposed second, fear crossed her face. Then it hardened. She lunged, not for the paper first, but for Eleanor, hand flashing out. Her ring struck Eleanor across the mouth. Pain bloomed sharp and metallic. Alistair moved between them so quickly the chair behind him tipped. "Stop!" The word cut the room clean. Lady Norbury tried to push past him toward the documents. He did not raise his voice. "Guards! Hold Lady Norbury for fraud and assault. She is to be conveyed to magistrate custody with these papers under seal." The guards obeyed at once. Marianne gasped. "Marianne." Felicity stared at Eleanor, then at the key outline still visible in her pocket, then lowered her eyes and said nothing. As Lady Norbury was taken out, she twisted once toward her daughters. "Speak!" Marianne stood rigid, lips pressed white. Felicity lifted her chin and answered without looking at her mother. "I saw you take Mr. MacDonald's seal from the escritoire and press it into wax after he was dead." Lady Norbury went very still, then struggled harder against the guards. The sound of her protest faded down the corridor. 3 days later, under a hard blue sky, after the storm had finally broken, Eleanor stood in open court between Alistair's solicitor and a clerk from Lincoln's Inn, while the magistrate reviewed each document. Parker testified to receipt logs and altered entries. Finch produced the copied eviction order and the original rain-stained sheet. Doctor. Harrow testified to injuries he had observed on Eleanor's wrists and lip and to Thomas's condition the night of the accident. Felicity gave sworn evidence, voice thin but clear, and did not glance toward her mother once. Marianne refused to testify and was dismissed. Whatever she knew, she never said. When the magistrate asked Eleanor whether she sought private settlement, she answered, "No, sir, public record." The judgment came before noon. Lady Norbury was convicted of fraud and unlawful coercion, fined and barred from administering any portion of the MacDonald estate. Restitution of Eleanor's trust, with accrued interest and costs, was ordered from attached assets and pending property sale. Assault was entered on record. Eleanor did not smile in the courtroom. She only exhaled as if she had been holding one breath for 3 years. That evening, back at Vale House, Alistair met her in the library with the court order and a locked dispatch box. "Your funds are transferred," he said. "Accounts in your name only. My solicitor will answer to you, not me." He set the box on the table and slid the key toward her. She touched it, but did not take it yet. "You said terms and enforcement." "I keep terms. And now—" His mouth shifted faintly. Not quite a smile. "Now you choose." She drew her father's pocket dictionary from her sleeve and opened to the hidden note. "Keep your name whole, even if they take the rest." She read it once, then closed the book and set her hand over the dispatch key. "I choose to stay," she said, "as contracted, as myself." By the second week of November, Thomas had progressed from slate letters to short pages, read aloud by the nursery fire, stumbling over long words and scowling when corrected. He called her Eleanor by his own insistence, and when he forgot and began with Miss, he would stop, frown, and begin again. The north room no longer smelled of shut air. Windows were opened in daylight. The pianoforte was tuned. Alistair entered only when invited, and always knocked once, even when Thomas called for him. On a clear morning in January, with frost silvering the square railings, Eleanor and Alistair were married in a small chapel, with Mrs. Ellis, Finch, Dr. Harrow, and Thomas in the front pew. No one called it rescue. No one called it gratitude. When the vicar asked her consent, she answered in a steady voice heard to the back wall. When the register was passed, she signed Eleanor MacDonald Vale and did not blot the ink. In March, they carried the last boxes into the former sanctuary together. Shelves replaced mourning drapery. The late Duchess's desk remained by the window, now polished and used. Eleanor unlocked the door with the iron key, then turned the brass bolt to show the first group of tenant daughters how it worked from inside and outside, how privacy was a right and not a privilege granted by mood. Thomas sat cross-legged on the rug, reading the names from a new attendant's slate. Mrs. Ellis arranged copybooks. Finch pretended not to approve and failed. Alistair stood at the threshold, broad shoulders filling the light, watching as girls in patched cloaks and careful braids crossed a doorway they had been taught to fear. He looked at Eleanor once, then at the key in her hand. "You kept it," he said. She placed the iron key on a ribbon at her waist and opened the door wider for the next child. "Yes," she said, "and I used it."